Hi, my name's John Sluter. When I was a kid, I used to enjoy those "there's a fly in my soup" jokes. I'm sure you remember them. They were like, waiter, there's a fly in my soup. Sir, be quiet, or everyone's going to want one. Or, waiter, what's this fly doing in my soup? The backstroke, I think. I thought about those jokes when I was reflecting on a series that I just watched on Amazon Prime called DNA. It's a Danish police procedural. And although I don't like to spend a lot of time with passive entertainments, I ended up binge watching the last 3 episodes, maybe 4. But as much as I think that it is a very good series, there was a certain flaw. To give you a brief encapsulation, the series is about a police investigator and the unit that he's in. They investigate child kidnappings, and that makes for a lot of pathos, a lot of drama. And at a certain point, the investigation becomes very personal to that investigator. The strength of the series is that the characters in the series are very real, very three-dimensional, very relatable. But there's an exception. There are some religious characters in this movie, and they are all religious zealots. I get the impression that this series understands all of its characters, but not the religious ones. It really has no idea of what religious people are like. It reminds me of movies that involved military characters in the penumbra of the Vietnam War in the late 70s, 80s, even the 90s. Many of those movies reflected stereotypes about military people that continued even into a couple of decades after the Vietnam War. They thought they understood military people. They really didn't. And I feel the same way about this series and its understanding about religion and religious people. But that considerable wrinkle does not overcome what I consider to be the excellence of that series. The excellence being the believability and the relatability of most of its characters, and the sensitive treatment that it gives to the subjects of grief and the intractability of loss. The idea brilliantly expressed in this film is that we make choices, and those choices have consequences and effects. Sometimes we may desperately wish to undo the choices that we've made because of their effects, but we can't. We might soften the effects around the edges, but at their core, the effects remain intractable and oftentimes tragic. And that's the idea that makes this series unsentimental but poignant, hard-headed but heartbreaking. Now, I wanted to use this series, DNA, as a springboard to talk about what response Christians should have to negative portrayals of Christianity in the media. How do we respond to attacks on Christianity? One response is to evaluate whether the attacks have merit. The truth is that we as Christians fall short. Christianity, as practiced, is invariably imperfect. And if it highlights something about us that is true, and I'm not saying that this film necessarily does, but if it highlights something about us that is true, then crying out about that depiction of Christianity won't make it false. The negative depiction of Christianity in this series, DNA, focuses on Roman Catholicism. It seems to me that many years ago, I remember reading somebody say that bigotry against Roman Catholicism is the single bigotry, at least here in America, that people can indulge without being immediately rebuked. Things have changed somewhat since then. I think in very recent times there has been a resurgence of tolerance for some kinds of bigotry. The other thing is that this video review is being made after the death of Pope Francis, but before the conclave that selects his successor. His 12-year papacy has made it much more difficult for people to mindlessly embrace some of the old stereotypes about Catholicism. Pope Francis had a personality and a ministry that undid many of those old negative stereotypes. Pope Francis embodied the advice that Paul gave to believers who faced criticism as a church or as believers. Paul said, when you hear those criticisms from outsiders, be better. Elevate your church. Be better Christians. And by being better people, persuade them that their criticisms are erroneous. Another living embodiment of Paul's advice to the early church comes from another Francis. This is Francis Collins. Francis Collins frequently debated Christopher Hitchens. There has been no more savage critic of the church in recent times than Christopher Hitchens. And Christopher Hitchens frequently lacerated Francis Collins on that debate stage. Christopher Hitchens died. He died of cancer. As frequently happens with that disease, his death was lingering and painful. With great courage, he actually wrote about his death. During that time of his transition from life to death, Francis Collins went to him, formed a relationship with him outside the debate stage. Everybody, I think, or many people, most people know about the story of the two thieves who died on the cross on either side of Jesus Christ. In the end, Christopher Hitchens did not die like the thief on one side who embraced Christ in his heart, but he didn't die like the other one who died cursing God. In the end, he embraced an idea which during most of his life was anathema to him. He embraced the idea that a reasonable, rational person could embrace Jesus Christ, could embrace Christianity. And here's the last point I want to make in this review of the series DNA. As I said before, it embraces an idea that some choices and their effects cannot be undone. But as a Christian, I belong to a religion that to some extent disagrees. I belong to a religion that embraces the story of the two thieves who died on the two crosses next to the cross of Christ. One of those brigands recognized that he deserved what was happening to him. He deserved the suffering and the death that he was receiving. And he recognized that Christ dying next to him did not. He had the opportunity to speak up and to refresh the Spirit of Christ, even in the dying moment of Jesus Christ. And he did. And he refreshed the Spirit of Christ. He was snatched from hell. That story of the man dying on the cross next to Christ reminds us that the effect of a life of sin can be undone by repentance. And so does the story of the prodigal son. I think so many people know that parable that I'm not going to repeat it here. If you don't know it, it's easy to find the parable of the prodigal son online. But in broad outline, it's a story about a man who demanded his inheritance from his wealthy father before his father had even died. He took his inheritance and squandered it in a distant land. And when he hit rock bottom, when he had no money left, when he realized that he, who had behaved swinishly toward his father, was not even eating as well as the pigs that he was hired to feed and tend, he decided to humble himself and make the long and hard trek back to his father. He went away from his father arrogant and foolish. He returned to his father wiser and truly humble. And to his great astonishment, his father welcomed him back. Now, in some ways, the parable of the prodigal son embraces some of the ideas brilliantly portrayed in the series DNA. He could not undo the fact that he squandered his inheritance, and he probably never repaired the relationship, or maybe he never repaired the relationship with his older brother. But one of the beautiful things about the parable of the prodigal son was that all of his sin and all of his foolishness and all of his arrogance became the foundation for his virtue. So, having said all those things, let me return to the beginning. I started by talking about the fly in the soup jokes that I think we all remember from our childhoods. It's hard to imagine drinking soup after finding a fly in it. And that's where the metaphor breaks down, because I actually recommend this film. I think anybody who might like a thoughtful police procedural series would enjoy it.